of othering. I'm truly grateful for so much about living and growing up and being born in this country. As a young child, I innocently assumed Britain was the best, and even best at everything. And you can forgive me being born in 1966 for thinking that was true about football as well. Back then I also imagined we had the best, even the most powerful armed forces in the world. This was my viewpoint as a child. My father had been in the Second World War. We knew people who were in the armed forces. And that was my perspective. That was my lens. When I was 18, I flew to Tel Aviv with a group of young Brits who were going to volunteer on a kibbutz, on a farm, a working farm in Israel for a year. After landing at night in Tel Aviv airport, we got the night bus to our kibbutz. I remember it vividly. Can you imagine the excitement of an 18-year-old landing in Israel and going off out into the desert at night in a bus? I then remember a young Israeli soldier taunting us on the bus. "The British Army is rubbish," he said, holding his gun. "The Israeli army is the best." And he went on rather aggressively to explain why we were rubbish and the Israeli army was so good. It nearly led to conflict in the bus. I was thinking, even at 18, doesn't he realise the British Army are the best? And one of the fellow volunteers actually nearly came to blows with him. It was very heated on landing in Israel. I think what stopped it was the fact that the soldier had a gun. But this us versus you, this I'm better than you mentality can so easily escalate. A little bit like the playground. And I remember it in a boys' school. My dad can beat your dad up. No, he can't. My dad can beat your dad up. More frighteningly, we see it happening with international relations as well. Well, after a few months in Israel, doing various jobs in the desert, in the heat of the desert, picking melons, that was my favourite one. I think my record was eating 8 melons in one morning. I'd have enough of melons, not surprisingly. And I decided to do something different, and I nearly joined the Israeli army. Even though I'm not Jewish, I nearly signed up for a year or two. Why would I do that? Well, maybe I had been convinced by this soldier that the Israeli army were the best, and I had heard about their grueling training, having to run up mountainsides, lots of mountainsides in Israel, carrying a telegraph pole. And I love the sound of that. I love the sound of learning Krav Maga, which is the Israeli martial art. I wanted to toughen up. Like many men who feel insecure, I thought the way to conquer that was to toughen up. My motivation had nothing at all to do with the rights and wrongs in the Middle East conflict. I was totally ignorant back in 1984. I knew some Palestinians were planting bombs on the buses in Israel, and I knew that because we weren't allowed to put our rucksacks underneath the bus or use the lockers because bombs were going off on buses at that time. I also know that the Lebanese were firing rockets into the Golan Heights from the Lebanon, and I know that because the zip factory on our kibbutz was blown up. Sadly, it was an excuse for a party amongst the volunteers because it was the most boring job on the kibbutz. But I guess at this stage I assumed Israel good, Palestinians the enemies bad. I am so glad I did not join the Israeli army on a number of levels. I'm here being one of them. Over the years since I've learned so much more about the Middle East conflict, and I've realised that it is so much more complex than good is versus bad is, as with so many conflicts. I gained even more insight 6 years ago when Ant, who's often on the sound desk, and my eldest daughter Hannah, we went to Israel and met with the Arabic Christians around Israel and heard and gained insight into the extreme challenges of Arabs living within Israel. I realised that there is violence and good on both sides of the conflict. Just so happens that one side is very, very, very much more powerful than the other. A little bit of a reverse David and Goliath situation in some ways. Don't know if you agree with me. It is so easy to think in binary ways, in dualism, good or bad, good is versus bad is. Often we are good, the enemy, they, them, are bad. This is called othering, looking upon the other in a very negative way. As a child, I don't know if some of you can relate to this as well, I was brainwashed by Hollywood. I loved country and western films, the westerns, I loved them. But I was convinced that the white American cowboys and the soldiers were good, and the Native American Indians evil. And I would sit there with my cowboy hat on and my guns, looking out for an Indian and shooting the Indians. Oh, I was so very wrong on that. As an adult, I realised the horrendous way they were treated by the new people coming to the land. We are so prone, though, to this dualism, this binary thinking. And we are all thinking that way when we're young, in the first half of life, as Richard Rohr calls it. However, many never grow out of this less mature way of thinking during the second half of life. They still stay in a very binary, black and white way of thinking. But those who do progress in some ways start to realise that life is more nuanced. They start to see good and bad and something in between in themselves, as well as everybody else. And that their own country of origin is mixed in many ways, as are all countries. And yes, with this in mind, it can be healthy to be thankful about aspects of the country we were born in and raised in and live in. And many of us are very thankful of that today. If this doesn't fall into pride, arrogance, and nationalism, us against the world kind of attitude. We are the greatest. Make this country great again. I can barely say that. Othering, us and them. Worryingly, very worryingly, there has been a real rise in nationalism around the world. And this is different to a healthy patriotism. Nationalism often happens during disrupted periods, instability in the midst of change. And have you noticed there's a lot of that going on in the world these days? But when this happens within a country, people within a country try to work out who is in, who is out. This kind of tribalism arises. Us versus them. The worthy versus the unworthy. And we work out who qualifies as us, who is worthy to be us. Who should we let in? And who, that phrase that we heard a lot during the American election, are the illegal immigrants or immigrants. And like in Canada, they take a very different approach for people coming into the country. They call them newcomers. I think that says a lot. This othering, it's more than disliking other people and certain groups. You start to see them as a threat. You dehumanize them and you can end up hating them. And there can be this othering towards other countries as well. Again, it's them and us. They are the enemy. They are evil. They are beyond goodness. The causes of war, past and present, are varied and complex. And I'm not going to be commenting on those causes today, although I love history. But what I'm saying is this: the more we do othering, the more likely it is that we will have more and more and more conflicts. Think of China versus the West. Think of a number of Arabic nations and Iran against the West and Israel. Think about Russia. Think about North Korea, and so on and so on and so on. And in all of this, I'm not downplaying human rights abuses that take place in many countries. Dare I say, every country. And the fact that some regimes appear more of a threat to world peace and have an extreme of nationalisms, I'm not playing that down. But when countries are the other, when we dehumanize other countries, and when we do easily slip into that we are the greatest kind of attitude, like on that night bus from Tel Aviv to the kibbutz, things can escalate and increase the likelihood of more conflict. Did you know that potentially there is one good thing about the global climate crisis we are in? And I hope you all realise and recognise we are in a crisis. What's that good thing? Well, yes, there is a danger that it will increase nationalism, as crises tend to do. And it will increase a selfish, all-for-us kind of way of thinking. What's best for our country? But there is one opportunity. It could actually help reduce othering, reminding us of our common humanity. We are all in this together. If the world goes down the pan, we all go down together. Nobody will be immune. In all of this, reduction of othering, wouldn't it be good if countries who are industrialised and who got there first, the wealthy countries, start to take responsibility for what we have done, and also in love and generosity help out those countries who are being impacted more quickly than we are. We will all be impacted, but some are struggling and suffering and being wiped out even now. It will take all of us to achieve the 1.5 degrees centigrade limit, and we can only do this together. Jesus said some tough things. Jesus' challenge to love even our enemies is challenging. He was using tax collectors as an example on purpose. They, for the Jewish people at that time, were the hardest people to love. We are to love even our enemies. Kingdom living is hard. To be perfect like God. Another way of saying there is always room for improvement. But that is Jesus' teaching. A change in our attitudes, a change in our awareness, recognising these things, first of all, is a good start, as is humility and a more nuanced thinking, less binary thinking, less dualistic thinking. Each country recognising, yes, its own good, but also its responsibilities and imperfections. Less about countries projecting our own badness, which is there, onto other countries. They're the baddies. Seeing humanity every single person as one family. Not othering. The antidote to othering is belonging, recognising that everybody belongs. Shouldn't this be our resolve this Remembrance Sunday? The best way to honour those within the armed forces and civilian casualties and deaths. Remember, yes, of course, but as a response, change our attitudes and actions further. Agape love that Jesus talks about. Recognising that no country is intrinsically perfect, unlike God, who is perfect. We all have work to do. But the good news is we are all loved by God. Everybody. Yes, everybody in this country, everybody in every country. And God asks us, you and me, not theoretical, you and me to do the same agape love towards everybody. And you and I know this is so hard. But even when it's seemingly impossible, this morning as we gather to remember those who have died in conflict, dare we believe that nothing is impossible with God. I'm going to invite you to stand if you're able, and we're going to